very much introduce our first speaker tonight, William Dartmouth, who you will, I'm sure, know of very well. Deputy Chair of UKIP and Member of the European Parliament for the South West Counties and Gibraltar. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, thank you all very much for coming to be here on this beautiful summer evening. But I do also particularly want to thank, I'm an old timer, so I always think of him as Dr. David Owen and his team. It's not often, like never, that we in UKIP get to be on the same platform as a former Foreign Secretary. You had a moving picture, moving pictures, which were both moving and also moving as well in what we've just seen. And you will have from me quite a lot of slides, because people always say we want facts, and these are lots and lots of facts. You don't have to absorb them, but just to know that we're there. The chair made an absolutely critical point, which is this: in the referendum, the status quo is not an option. Either we get out of the EU now, or we will be stuck in, as it were, a sealed railway carriage to an unwanted and thoroughly undesirable destination that is against our national interest, which is to say, the UK becomes a mere province in a protectionist European superstate. Now, I'm going to talk mostly about trade, which is the area which I cover, and a little bit about influence. And so perhaps we could have the first slide. Here we are, to make it nice and neutral. We're going to talk, looking at exports and imports to and from the US by the UK, China, and Japan. And the central point here, which I will be attempting to hammer home in the next 7 or 8 minutes, is that you do not need to have a trade agreement in order to be able to trade. There's no trade agreement between the United States and China. There's no trade agreement between the United States and Japan, and there's no trade agreement between the United States and the UK. There never has been. Now, I think we will go on to the next one, which is this. In the light of what President Obama said, I actually looked up the countries with which the United States does have trade agreements with, and there are 20 countries here. And each one of those countries has a smaller GDP than the UK, usually much smaller. So the United States, for example, has a trade agreement with the Emirate of Bahrain, Costa Rica, Guatemala, the Sultan of Oman, and Peru. Nonetheless, we in the UK have been told that we are at the back of the queue. So compare that, which was said, with the 20 countries that do have trade agreements with the United States. And British establishment politicians should therefore have no illusions on what the President thinks of the so-called special relationship. He has spelt it out, and the conclusion is that we and they should be less subservient to the US. And in particular, we should start off by ceasing to support unequivocally, US State Department policy. And for one example of that is for Turkey to become a member of the European Union, which is an entirely reckless policy which is against our national interest. Now, as we're on the US, go to the next slide. Let's take a look at the North American Free Trade Area, which is usually known by its initials as NAFTA. Now, in terms of GDP, I've got 2 points to make here. NAFTA is larger than the European Union. And you can see that over 80% of the exports of Mexico went to the 2 other countries in NAFTA. With Canada, the equivalent figure is also almost 80%. By comparison, with the UK and the EU, the figure is 43%, and that percentage is falling. Nevertheless, we are constantly told, you would have seen on the 6 o'clock news today, that because maybe 43% of our exports go to the EU, that is in itself sufficient reason for the UK to be in the EU political union. As we have just seen, Canada and Mexico have almost 80% or more of their exports going to the North American free trade area. Nonetheless, no serious person puts this forward as a reason for Canada and Mexico to be in a political union with the United States. President Obama does not, even David Cameron does not, and they can't even find a Miliband brother to put forward that proposition. We should also note, and this is the second point here, the second of 2 points, that with NAFTA, there are border posts between the United States and Canada, and there are border controls between the United States and Mexico. In the very successful trading bloc that is NAFTA, there is free movement of goods, services, and capital. But there is no free movement of people, none at all. A country can trade, and trade very successfully, without free movement of people, and it is a pity that the Prime Minister and the BBC insist on telling us something entirely different. It's just not true. Next, please. And this one we're now going to leave out. Oh, yes, here one. New Zealand trade agreements. No, we want to leave this. Now, trade agreements. Although they aren't necessary, they are desirable. Now, Chile, to New Zealand, Iceland, to name just 3 countries, unlike the United Kingdom, all have the right to negotiate their own trade agreements because these countries are not in the European Union. They're independent. And to take one example, here is a list of New Zealand's trade agreements. And it's an impressive list, and it negates the proposition, which again you hear put forward constantly, and on the BBC, by the way, that you have to be in a big trading bloc in order to be able to negotiate trade agreements. Chile, New Zealand, even Iceland, all have trade agreements with China. By comparison, the EU does not and will not anytime soon. And there's a reason for this. It's actually much easier and more straightforward to negotiate trade agreements for one independent country and not one of a bloc of 28. The EU Trade Commissioner is obliged to take into account and encompass the interests of all 28 member states, and that is very difficult. Herding cats would be easier, and in a metaphor I wish I'd come up with, but Boris Johnson said, it is like some gigantic 28-strong pantomime horse. It just doesn't work. Very difficult. That's why it takes them 7 or 8 years to negotiate a trade agreement. Now, we're going to talk about access to the EU markets, which is complete rubbish talked about all the time. As I believe I've demonstrated, a trade agreement with the EU is not necessary in order to trade with people and businesses in the EU member states. Access to EU markets does not depend on having a trade agreement, far less on being an EU member state. And this next slide shows the context. The fact of the matter is that there's been a dramatic fall in global tariffs since we went in 1973, or with transitions it's really 1975. And the average of external tariffs is only around 3%. There are, of course, some exceptions. Now, and this is the consequence. Now to the European Union and trade. Next. Now this slide shows the value of the trade between the 20 countries outside the EU and the EU member states in 2015. It's imports plus exports, trade. And the key figure is the one at the bottom, 2,720 billion euros. Now, numbers are inherently comparative. So what is that number? And the answer is the value of this trade, imports and exports by all these countries outside the European Union, was just 20 of them, was worth more than the entire economy of France, more than the entire economy here in the UK, and it was even worth more than Tony Blair and Cherry Blair got paid last year. Now, the fact is that a country does not have to be in the European Union in order to be able to trade with it and trade very successfully. Next, and then we're just going to go quickly on to the next one. Let's look at China. Now, I produced this slide. I've never seen this anywhere else, but I have given it to the folks at Vote Leave. I still haven't seen it anywhere else, by the way. China exports roughly 1.5 times what the United Kingdom, exports to the EU in goods alone. So we would, and this is the point, we would absolutely not be leaving EU markets when we exit the EU. It is crystal clear the trade would continue. And what you see from there, the top line is from the Treasury's ONS Pink Book, the bottom line is from Eurostat. What you see here, and what the facts demonstrate, is that China, not an EU member, Mr. Miliband and others, and without a trade agreement with the EU, nevertheless has access sufficient to export more goods to the EU than we do it in the UK, and to the tune of 1.5 times. I would particularly draw your attention to the last line, 301 billion euros versus our 190 billion. Now here is another point which confirms this. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is the list of the top 10 non-EU aircraft exporters. And the key point here is that the top 3 exporters to the European Union, Russia, China, and the United States, 6 of the top 10, and 11 of the top 20 trading countries do not, repeat, not have trade agreements with the European Union. And the facts are clear. You do not need a trade agreement in order to trade very successfully and very profitably. And that is the point. These countries all trade with the EU within the framework and under the rules of the World Trade Organization, and that is one option for the UK after exit, one that is always available, and one that the EU cannot practically block. And one further nerdy academic, although I'm not an academic point, I'm beginning to have an academic monkey point. The moment, we do have a seat on the World Trade Organization, but it is the moment, it is in abeyance, it has a kind of observer status. The moment that we leave the European Union, our seat on the World Trade Organization has full rights, and we can speak up for UK trade and UK interests, and our seat is no longer submerged as one of 28. That all trade would cease on Brexit is not a tenable proposition. The facts are clear. It's just not true. And it follows from that the myth of the 3 million jobs which ought to be lost is just that, a myth. And it is worse than that. It is a deliberate deceit on the electors of our country, and I wish the BBC and others would stop it, and stop it now. But there is one category of people who will lose their jobs on Brexit, and that is members of the European Parliament, such as myself. That always gets the biggest round of applause. Now, we have a map of trade agreements here, which we're, yeah, here we are. This is what I call the Steve Crowther point, who's actually here, who's chairman of UKIP, which I didn't think of until he made this point to me. This is the list of the EU trade agreements. And there you are, gigantic list. You can't see it very easily on that screen. So the EU has, for example, trade agreements with Peru, Chile, Madagascar, Costa Rica, Moldova, and the Seychelles. It's about 100. It's about 100. And there is a conclusion from this. It will be very odd, not to say bizarre, not to say counterintuitive, not to say against the European Union's commercial interests, for them not then, given all those other countries, to have one with the UK on Brexit. Very simple point. Now, however, I'm going to now draw on a little bit on what the chairperson said. Let's look at the economic future of the EU. This is lightning speed. It's going to take about 90 seconds. I've just distilled it down. 9 years of thinking about it. Here we are. The EU's share of global GDP is in long-term decline. The next chart's much better. Next. This was the world economy in 1980. Share of the European Union, about 30%. Pretty impressive, actually. Now, next. It's less than 20%. And in 2039, it is projected to be next less than 10%. And the fact of the matter is that the economic prospects for the EU and the Eurozone are dire, not to say dismal. Next slide. This simply says that the level of employment is low. And that's because the level of unemployment is high. And if I can just draw your attention to this, here's another slide comparing the UK's unemployment rate with youth unemployment in several Eurozone countries. Now, our level of youth unemployment is about 20%, much too high. We should be doing better. But this compares with 40% in Italy, about 50% or more in southern Italy, over 50% in Spain, and coming up to 60% in Greece. And the fact, if you're a young person in any of those countries, your chances of getting a job are really not very good at all. And the fact remains that in this big campaign with maximum coverage, the UK establishment is completely failing to explain why it wants the UK to be linked, indeed subsumed in ever closer union, to the low growth, low employment, high youth unemployment, high tax economies of the EU and the Eurozone. That is a dismal economic proposition. Now, one justification often given is the single market, which is touted as one of the benefits of the EU. I just make one central statistical point here. Only about 12.5% of the UK economy is accounted for by exports to the European Union, and that proportion is declining. But nevertheless, 100% of our economy is subject to job-destroying and economically destructive EU regulation. And we saw a fantastic example just now in the film on the environmental and economic disaster that is the common fisheries policy. And that's never something. And now we're going to quickly go on to the next slide. Most people don't know this. This was in a briefing for MEPs, there's mounds of paper. Somehow I happened to read this one. And perhaps our distinguished chair, probably one person who knows this. The EU single market is just not there in services. It's only 5%. Trade integration only stands at 5% for services. And this is in an EU Commission report, which was quoted by what is called, and as a former foreign secretary, in the jargon is called UKIP, which is the UK's representative to the European Union. So it's a pretty fallen. So we're giving up all these things for just 5% access in services. Doesn't make it any sense. Now, for a couple of minutes, I'm now going to say, but the establishment claims that all this is justified because we have real influence as an EU member. So let's take a look for a couple of minutes at how much influence we actually have. And there's no more economic statistics in my speech, by the way. So here we are, next slide, MEPs. Well, MEPs are not particularly important, but the UK has just 9.7% of MEPs. And in case anyone wants to know the exact figure, it's 73 out of 751. The point being that the UK MEPs, even if they all vote together, can't block anything. But it's the Commission, which, as it were, is the government, is the real thing. Next. And in the Commission, we just have one of 28 commissioners. And by the way, it's worth noting that in Mrs. Thatcher's day, it was 2 out of 13. Now let's see, just for fun, let's have a look and see where our one UK commissioner sits in this European government, that is the European Commission. First of all, here is the President of the Commission, a former Prime Minister of Luxembourg. And by the way, the population of Luxembourg is, broadly speaking, around about the same as Plymouth, however you define the Plymouth boundaries. And here's the President, a very grand fromage, with his private jet. I looked it up, it's a Cessna Citation. And below that, the next slide, here we are. And below him are the 2 vice presidents who report directly to the President of the Commission. Now, are either of these our British Commissioner? I'm afraid not. Let's go to the reporting tier below. This is a bit like an American bank, actually. There is a reporting tier below. And the next slide. And these people, again, they don't report directly to... No, sorry, if we go back. No, yeah, yes, they're the two vice presidents. Next slide. Sorry, I spoke too quickly. That's incorrect. They don't report directly to Juncker. They report directly to the two vice presidents. And there are 4 of them there. Surely one of these must be the British Commissioner, who we are told wields so much influence and for whom we have given up so much of our ability to run ourselves. Surely there's a British Commissioner there. I'm afraid not. So here we are. Here's the final tier with 20 commissioners. And here at last, outlined in red, we see, akin to the fourth sparrow in amateur dramatics, roughly akin to the fourth spear carrier from the left, somewhere between the Slovenian and the Slovakian, our own very influential British commissioner. And there he is. And by the way, he directly reports to the commissioner from Finland, who's actually younger than he is. Sometimes it happens in life, but it's not so enjoyable. He's actually at the 4th level. The fact of the matter is that when you hear the word influence, the fact of the matter is that in the European Union, the UK has no meaningful influence. And the mantra, the chant of influence, influence, influence that we hear all the time from Europhile politicians and their hangers-on in the media has absolutely no basis in reality at all. We have no proper influence and we never will have. And now, in conclusion, and this is the key point, our sovereignty, our ability to govern ourselves, we've already given it, most of it, away. Already there is a European Union flag, an EU Parliament, an EU national anthem, a European Union diplomatic service, an EU Supreme Court. Our passports have become European Union passports. Take a look at yours. And the one thing one can confidentially say about the European Union is that the worst is yet to come. Between now and June the 23rd, they are momentarily, for these few weeks, on their version of best behavior. We are destined, if we stay in, as I mentioned before, we are destined to be a mere province in a protectionist European superstate. So I'm going to end up now with two quotes. On the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, in one of his more obscure plays, Richard II, there's this great phrase, that England that was wont to conquer others